Start. Thank you all very much for coming today. My name's Alex von Tunzelmann. I'm a British historian, and I wrote a book called Indian Summer, which is most relevant to this, about partition of India and Pakistan. And I'm here today with Kamila Shamsie, who needs very little introduction. She is a multiple award shortlisted author, the author now of 6 books, I think, with this. This is number 6. Okay, that's more than a lot of people manage. I've done 2. She is a wit, a wisdom, and a wonderful woman, so no pressure to impress this crowd. And her new book, which we're launching today, is A God in Every Stone. I'm going to read you the description from the press release, which says, "It's a rich and vivid tale of friendship, injustice, love, and betrayal. A God in Every Stone carries you on an epic journey to India, France, England, and Turkey. This masterfully crafted novel explores the heart of empires fallen and conquered. It reminds us that we all have our place in the chaos of history, and that so much of what is lost will not be forgotten." It's also absolutely brilliant, and I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting here. Kamila, how would you describe the book?
I had a journalist the other day say to me, "Could you describe your novel in one word?" And I said, well, there's a reason it took me 300 pages to write the thing. How would I describe? I'm very bad at describing my own books.
I think many authors are.
Yeah, so I wouldn't.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why there's someone else doing that press release.
The book focuses on, it starts with a character called Vivian Rose Spencer, who's an English woman who has an interest in archaeology, and it's during World War I. And I was struck by Vikram Seth talking yesterday about how he had, with An Unequal Music, he had met his lead character. He'd been in Hyde Park in London, and he had seen this man walking by the Serpentine who he decided, that's the lead character of my novel. And I wanted to ask, where did you meet Vivian Rose Spencer?
It's interesting because she's a character I didn't meet until very long after I started writing her. I had a very hard time with her. And I had this English woman who was an archaeologist, and she just wasn't living on the page. It's one of the strange things as a writer, you can't quite figure out how it happens. That the two Pashtun brothers in there, Qayyum and Najib Gul, they sort of, fell on the page fully formed practically. And with Viv, it took me a very long time, and what really helped me was reading about women archaeologists around the First World War and what their lives were. In this strange period where, it was, I think, an interesting thing to be a woman, because you had the suffragette movement, which had been very strong, and a lot of women were opposed to it. But it was something that was very much happening, and you had women demanding the vote for women. In the news, and then you had the war break out and women going into work, but you also had, at this time, women archaeologists. It's really sort of that the decade that starts in a major way archaeology for women, and I think it's sort of around 1911 or so that you have the first all-female digs going on, and they're by a group of American women. And so it's sort of, she came to me really in an odd way from the times around her. And from sort of what was going on with different kinds of English women, I started to sort of go backwards from the very large scale to narrowing down to who she was. But really, I wrote many drafts of her before I knew her at all.
So you came to know her gradually. And I was going to ask also about Qayyum and Najib Gul, the Pashtun brothers. How about them? You say they were more fully formed at the beginning.
Yeah, and it's a strange thing that you mentioned, Vikram meeting this character in Hyde Park and writing about her. I had a very weird version of that, which was I had written most of the book, and there's, at the beginning of the novel, when you first meet Najib Gul, he's 11 years old, and I had written a couple of drafts of it, and Najib was a character I knew, quite intimately from the beginning. And I was in Peshawar a couple of years ago, and my father's best friend had taken my sister and me along, and he was videoing, and then he sent me a video that he'd taken. And there's one point where my sister and I had walked ahead, and there were some schoolboys who saw him with a camera, and they just started sort of, as Pakistani boys do, making a show in front of the camera and sort of raising their school hats and laughing. And I was watching it, and there was Najib. I mean, there was a boy who looked as I imagined I can't describe what that moment. I just froze that and had a still of it, and I thought, oh, there he is. He's in Peshawar today.
He'll never know.
He'll never know. Yeah.
He could be here now.
Yeah. But Qayyum was different. So originally, the novel was about these archaeologists. It was about this English woman, Vivian Rose Spencer, and this young Pashtun archaeologist, Peshawari archaeologist. And in the beginning, when I first started writing, I made a reference to his brother. There was a one line about his brother who'd been a soldier in the army and was now, follower of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and, in the way of non-violence. And he was really going to be a very minor character, Qayyum. But he just, as I was writing more about Najib, I really became much more interested in this brother, and he becomes, the focal brother of the two.
Yes, absolutely, he does. I'm going to ask you to read just a paragraph from the book, because the language is so wonderful, and I really want the audience to get a flavour of it. I'm sure lots of you haven't yet read it, it's going to come out very recently. This paragraph is from early in the book. It's when Vivian Rose Spencer is in Turkey, where she's been on an archaeological dig with an archaeologist called Tahsin Bey. And there's sort of a bit of a crush developing from her on him, and there's just this beautiful passage that I'd like you to read back on.
There are passages of time a person enters, knowing unshakably that they will always retain a rare luster, one that will gleam more brightly as disappointments attach themselves to life. That was once me, Viv thought, anticipating the reminiscences of her future self. That was once me, plucking figs off branches and cramming them into my mouth while watching the sun glitter from the Korean coast to the horizon, across water as blue as ink and clear enough to see all the way to the rocks at the base of the cliffs. Almost driven mad by the purple on my tongue, the blue in my sight. A moment to understand sirens weren't creatures of the sea. They were the sea itself. Tahsin Bey laughed as though he'd heard her thoughts and said, "Look, your eyes have changed color. The Aegean Sea is in them now." Lightly touching her wrist at the jut of her bone, he added, "And the sun is in your skin." The metamorphosis of Vivian Rose Spencer.
Thank you. I did say it was beautiful, and it really is. And I love this idea that, in the first sentence there, the passages of time that you enter into knowing that you're going to remember that always. I remember at university, it wasn't me, sadly, I wish I could say I coined this, but somebody coined the term pre-stalgia, like nostalgia, but
right.
You sort of know you're having it at the time. Yeah. And it's a sort of very romantic idea, and this does turn out to be a hugely key moment for Viv, doesn't it, in the book? And it dominates really the rest of the narrative. And she's on a quest of sorts, into which the figs are woven. Yeah. I don't want to give too much away.
No, we'll give a little bit away. It starts with her in Turkey on a dig, and she's her father is friends with an archaeologist, a Turkish man called Tahsin Bey, and he, although he's then certain ideas he has about what women should and shouldn't do, but he's perfectly happy for his daughter to go off on this dig with this old friend of his. And the old friend Tahsin Bey is obsessed with a man called Skylax, who we should all know about. How many people here know about Skylax? Anyone? A few, couple, yeah.
A couple of hands.
Skylax was, to the best of anyone's knowledge, as far as I can make out, the first man from outside the subcontinent to travel here and write about it. So the Emperor Darius sent him in 515 BC. And he traveled either from Peshawar or from Attock. It was a town called Kaspatiras, which is one of those two places, or somewhere around there. And he traveled along one of the tributaries of the Indus and then down the Indus itself and wrote about it. And what he wrote formed the Greek and Persian imagination about the subcontinent for, until Alexander's men went and gave a different view of things. And he exaggerated wildly, and they were full of tales. And one of my favorites is, he described a tribe of India. He was clearly very obsessed with the heat, because a lot of things he wrote were how people dealt with the heat. So he described a tribe of Indians, as of course they were then, who had ears like parasols. Oh no, ears like winnowing fans. And so, when it got hot, they would just sort of cool themselves by fanning their ears.
Useful, yeah.
And another were a tribe of men with very large feet. And when it became really hot in the afternoon, they would lie on their backs and hold a leg up, and their very large foot would form a shadow like a parasol, which they would then sleep under.
Sometimes I've wished I had one of those.
I know. I do like to joke about skylarks. That we complain now about Western misrepresentation of this part of the world, but it's been going on since then.
I got started. Well, although if he was from Darius sent him, was he Persian?
Well, he was west to us, but he was from the westernmost bit of the Persian Empire. So he was what is now Turkey. So that cusp of things. But I invent for skylarks an artifact, which is a fig circlet, a crown made of fig leaves and fig fruit, which Darius gives him in my account of things. And first Thersine Bey is obsessed with finding this, because he's from the same part of the world as skylarks. And then Viv, when she is separated by the war from Thersine Bey, this fig circlet becomes her connection to him, and she then starts to think she'll find it for various reasons in Peshawar, and that's how the story moves her to Peshawar, where she meets the Gul brothers.
Mm-hmm. A theme that I saw a lot in this book that I thought was really fascinating, and it's something that's always interested me about the empire, is the possibilities that the empire has for reinvention. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's involuntary. In the case of Kayum Gul, he's, of course, he has to go and fight in World War I in Europe, and this is something that he, so it sort of invents him because he moves to this different place, fights in Ypres, which they call Vipers.
Yeah.
And I was very struck, actually, because just this week the British Library have put online letters from Indian soldiers who fought in World War I, and there were 1 million people from here who did, and a lot of them were Punjabi Muslims.
Yeah, literally 1 million people.
It was literally 1 million people.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's not a rough million. And there were these extraordinary letters. I was reading a few excerpts from it that were published in The Guardian, and there's this one that really struck me because it really reminded me of Kayum Gul, that somebody said, he wrote home to his family, "No man can return to the Punjab whole, only the broken-limbed can go back." And that was, of course, the case. If you got injured, you could go back. But there was this sort of emasculating effect of that.
It wasn't just you had to get injured, you had to get very badly injured. There's a book edited by David O'Macy, which is Indian Voices from the Great War, which is a collection of the letters home. And one of the complaints the soldiers have is that they feel that an Indian soldier is sent back into battle much more quickly or readily than an English soldier, and that you have to have lost a limb, an eye, or your mind in order to be discharged from the army. And so you have men who are multiply wounded and keep getting sent back. So this idea that you keep on fighting, or if you do return home, you've lost something. And of course, if you're a novelist, you can't help then taking that idea of loss as metaphor as well. What else is lost? And for, Kayum loses an eye and then sees the world differently.
Very much so, absolutely. And there's also this wonderful section where he's in... the wounded Indian soldiers, some of them were put up in the Brighton Pavilion, which is a palace that was built by the Prince Regent in Brighton, it's my hometown. And it's sort of an Orientalist fantasy, these onion domes by the sea in Brighton, and this kind of mix of chinoiserie and Indo-Saracenic touches and all sorts of things. And, they wrote very fascinatingly, the Indian soldiers in real life, about this, because they were in this fabulous palace, and Kayum Gul really feels that as well. He feels initially, before some aspects become more sinister, he feels quite privileged.
There are a lot of the soldiers' letters when they're writing back. And it is, I don't know how many people have been to or seen pictures of the Brighton Pavilion, but it's a really strange thing because, as Alex says, it is an Orientalist fantasy, and there are these domes, and it looks in some way like the architecture of certain parts of India. In fact, at the Karachi Lit Festival a couple of weeks ago, there was someone there who lives in Brighton, and I took him to Mohatta Palace, and he looked up, he said, "Oh, that's what the Brighton Pavilion wanted to look like."
Yes, right. That's pretty much it.
And so to imagine these Indian soldiers, and they've been to Ypres or somewhere, they've been through the most devastating trench warfare and other things. And then for practically all of them, maybe all of them, it is the first time that they actually come into the heart of the empire which they've been living in, is to arrive in Brighton in this weird, mad place, which is sort of looks like it wants to be India but really isn't. And the British were very careful that they wanted, the soldiers to feel well cared for, because of course these men are going to go back into the battlefield. So they had such things as there were 7 different kitchens for different religions and different castes, and which of course is also part of the whole divide people up way of imperial rule. But the soldiers were largely very impressed, and they were really amazed that the king had. There was a rumor put about, which the English did nothing to dissipate, that this was the king's actual palace, which he had given up for the soldiers to live there. Though of course the royal family hadn't lived there for
a couple of hundred years.
100 years.
100 years.
So they were. Many of them were very impressed by what they saw. Many of them didn't want to go back and thought this was sort of a version of heaven. But of course the great anxiety was now you had all these, although injured, still in many ways strapping military Indian men roaming around with these English women. And that was a big no-no. So they had to be found ways to contain them. So they came as these sort of war heroes, but then they had to be also kept away from English women, and so there were these restrictions on their lives and this mistrust there, as well as this great bounty. So it was a very curious mix of things.
And there's kind of a wonderful mirror of that in the book, in that of course in Peshawar it's the other way around, that you've got the Indian men trying to stay away from the English woman, and there's a different kind of gender split going on, and women in their burqas. Just while we're on the pavilion, actually, you know what, can I spring an extra paragraph on you?
Sure.
Because I really do like this description, and it will give you a sense. I mean, it is a pretty fabulous palace, although a bit bonkers into the bargain. It's just that paragraph on the blue tab.
This thought first came to him when he looked at the great chandelier in Ward 1, which was once the banqueting room, its immensity hanging from the claw of a silver dragon. The long-tongued beast descended from copper banana leaves, which seemed to grow straight out of the painted foliage on the ceiling. Was it beautiful or ugly? He couldn't decide. But he knew that this one chandelier had more grandeur than all of Peshawar. In time he came to see the chandelier as empire. The king was the silver dragon, one single claw bearing the weight of smaller dragons, glass lotus flowers, a star of mirrors. He repeated this to one of the English doctors, and thereafter he was called upon whenever there were important visitors to explain that when he looked at the chandelier, he gazed upon the glory of the king. What he said was a source of marvel equaled, if not exceeded, by the fact that he said it in English. When the supervising nurse was there to hear the compliment, she'd wink at Qayyum and place a finger on her lips. She was the one who had taught him the English words he hadn't known, polished the grammar of his sentences, explained that the glass objects were lotus flowers and not replicas of the dusters which the staff used to clean the chandeliers.
I love that. It's a very funny book as well, actually, in places, as well as very moving. And this theme of reinvention is also, I mean, as I said, it goes both ways, doesn't it? I mean, there's also this voluntary reinvention that Viv does of herself, and that actually back at home as well, she's quite constrained. Her father's very anti-suffragette. She's not particularly pro-suffragette, is she? A friend of hers is. And she has quite a constrained life herself, and very much constrained by a powerful father. And actually it's by moving out, by moving east, that she finds her own freedom and identity.
Yeah, because of course, patriarchy is the world's longest running empire, and it's everywhere and not going anywhere. And I was sort of interested in the way you have these two, you have the English woman and the Indian man. And they're both sort of have above them, in some sense, Englishmen.
Yes.
But it works in very different ways. And they both have different kinds of freedoms and constraints on them. But I was particularly interested in the way, it's much less interesting to me to have the story where it's, the English have freedom and the Indians are the ones who are colonized. But they also both, Qayyum starts being a loyal subject to the king. And Viv starts the book very much, her father's daughter. She thinks suffragettes are a bad thing because her father thinks they're a bad thing. Her father, his way of praising her daughter is to say that she's she's as good as a boy, or she's almost as good as a boy, and to treat her as the son he never had. And she has to sort of find a way out of that and learn that actually there's a problem there. There's a problem in the way he's thinking about women, and that she herself needs to think differently. So to me, it is a story of these two parallel moves towards wanting a different structure of power in the world.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's a kind of intersection as well of race and class and gender, isn't there, really? In that, I mean, I'm often struck by this with one of my favourite real life stories is the real story of The King and I. I'm sure it's a musical, probably a lot of you have seen. Still banned in Thailand, but I think you're allowed to see it in Pakistan, as far as I'm aware. But basically it's this story, the musical is about an English lady governess who goes to, at the time it was a closed court of Siam, and kind of has this semi-romantic entanglement with the king. It's based on the real diaries of this woman called Annalia Nowens, but actually there was a very interesting biography of her a few years ago when it turned out that she was not in fact a posh English governess. In fact, she was an Indian woman who had, yes, she was mixed race. She had an English father, an Indian mother, but she had been brought up in Bombay, and she reinvented herself because Thailand was a closed court. Siam at the time was a closed court. Nobody there had ever met an English woman, so she turned up, and of course she didn't have the right accent. She knew none of the right things. And she was, had a coloured skin as far as they were concerned. And yet, because nobody there knew, she just passed herself off as this English governess, and everyone just believed her.
I feel a Desi remake of The King
and
I coming up.
Yes, please. If anybody's here, go right ahead. It's a very good story. Yeah. And it's sort of fascinating to me, and I think, in a sense, I thought a bit of that with Viv, because although she's not doing that, there is, and it's a little exchange that I just wanted you to read between her and Mr. Remick, who's the sort of, he's the British resident, isn't he, in
political agent, yeah.
Sorry, I should know that. Agent.
I don't know the difference between the resident and political agent, but I suspect you
it's
do.
Whether it's a princely state or not.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay.
But yeah, he's trying to stop her going on this dig in Peshawar, and she's keen to do it, and she just plays on that difference. If you could perhaps read their exchange just there.
So she, as I said, she goes to Peshawar because she wants to look for this artifact, so she wants to join this dig, and she's talking to Remick about it. And he says, "Miss Spencer, I should strike a note of caution. I know there have been women archaeologists in Greece and Turkey, even Egypt, but this is Peshawar. Pathan men don't much like the idea of women. Don't much like the idea of women doing what? Don't much like the idea of women." She thought of the Pathan soldier on the train, the ease of the silence between them right at the end, but who knew what he'd really been thinking? She said, "Are the English in India in the habit of having our behavior dictated by the natives?" Ha! Well expressed. He raised his glass to her, to the dig season.
So you see, it's interesting because Viv herself actually is really rather free from prejudice, but she knows how just to play that with the British, just to suggest to this English man that in fact he might be overruled by an Indian man, and then suddenly it all changes. So she's playing on those differences rather wonderfully. And actually I just want to add to that because it picks up on something you just said, I think, if I can find this. Yes, later on you say that she, it's an observation that Gayum makes, that she walks through the walled city as if she had more right to it than any man of Peshawar. And that's something, isn't it, where the English kind of assume this belonging.
Yeah.
Because it is complicated that she's out there. It's not, much as she is, it's wonderful the way you weave in that it is kind of her own reinvention, but it's, it's complicated. The effect that has on the local population is not, it's not without impact.
No, it is complicated. I mean, she's a single English woman who's, gone off to Peshawar, and you keep having the English in particular think the only reason for a young single English woman to have turned up in Peshawar is because she's looking for a husband, and she turns up in summer, and most of the English have gone up to Shimla. So the ones who remain keep saying, "Go up to Shimla. That's where the parties are, and that's where the husband hunting is going on, and she's there for this archaeological dig and getting really annoyed by the whole thing. And her refuge becomes this young boy, Najib. But she is, you said she's free of prejudices. She's not entirely.
No.
She just comparatively.
Yeah.
So compared to Remick, she is. But she is a woman of her time. And it was one of the difficulties with learning to love her, because I had to write her. But she's a woman so smart, and she sees through most prejudices, and therefore I wanted her to be able to see through all of them. But there is a level at which she is an English woman of the 20th century. She does believe the English are superior, and that the best thing you can do for a native is give them an English sort of education, and then they'll get as good as you can be while not being English. But she, so she believes very much that, other people can aspire to Englishness and pretty much get there, but there is, to her, the English way is the best way. So it was sort of a difficult thing to contend with in her. It was odd. I found it, and I'm disturbed by this in myself, I found it much easier to love Qayyum despite his difficult attitude towards women than I did to love Viv with her less difficult attitude towards the natives, Because I think I kept thinking, well, you should know better because you figured out most of it, right?
But yeah, I mean, exactly, and I think there's that sort of, but it's a very present trait in British imperialism, particularly kind of, the sort of older, well-meaning paternalistic type, the sort of Lord Macaulay type, is the idea that actually, you're going to enrich the natives. And there's, I mean, as you said, she can be to her father almost as good as a boy, and they can be almost as good as a white person. There's this kind of near miss. And, I think that's something that you see so much in the British attitude, especially in the 19th century, is this idea that it's actually, a kind of... You see it in India, and you actually don't see it anywhere else in the empire, which is interesting. It's the only place really where there was this attempt to educate the natives, and it's incredibly patronising and paternalistic, and now we'd all have a lot of criticisms of it, I'm quite sure. But at the time, this was completely different from how the British were ever treated the natives of, say, America or Australasia or Africa or anywhere else. And I think, my thinking on it is always because the British came to India, and India was at the time much greater than England. So they were not contending with the same situation. They were contending with Akbar's empire. It was a very different picture.
It's an interesting one. I mean, it is, one of the things that one of my problems with this book is I've written several drafts of it, and so as I'm about to, I think, quote from it, I'm thinking, did I actually leave that line in this version? So who knows? At some point there was a reference to her hearing a gentleman called Woolley, who was an actual archaeologist, and if you read his autobiography called Spadework, which is a lovely title, he says it's really important to watch your workmen when you're digging in the dark corners of the world, sort of Mesopotamia or wherever. He says because when you watch them, you see man as he must have been, in primitive times, basically these primitive people. And so Viv's way of being a little better than Woolley but not quite good enough is she sort of reflects on this comment that if you're watching the natives, you're watching pre-modern man or ancient man. And she says, well, but yeah, that's probably true, but why shouldn't there be a Herodotus here? So if you're going to have the Indians of the 20th century are reflecting ancient men, they can reflect the great ancient men and not just the primitive, cave dwellers.
It's a little bit of an improvement.
A little bit of an improvement, yeah.
Baby steps.
Not really nearly enough.
No. Yeah. But yeah, she does have that, and she's got a romantic fascination with it, which of course a lot of people did. But actually, in the seeds of that, that's another thing I sort of saw coming out of the book is how actually something I often think again about the British Empire is that it really did in India, it did very carefully sow the seeds of its own destruction. And part of the way it did that was by this kind of Macaulayite idea of education, because of course what happened when you educated these people to believe in these strong Western values of freedom and democracy is that they wanted freedom and democracy, and they didn't really want the empire anymore. And of course that was exactly the education that Jinnah and Nehru and Gandhi and all these men had, and why they started to have ideas like that. And similarly, you sort of say, first of all, that education kind of, leads to people thinking, well, hold on a minute, why shouldn't I have that too? But then you also see that with Qayyum, in that although he isn't going through the same classical education, he goes through this this experience of being this honoured king's soldier, of being part of something and part of an important thing. And then the rewards aren't the same, and he is different, and he starts thinking, hold on a minute,
Yeah, but what he does like is loyalty, brotherhood, something to fight for.
Yes.
And so it becomes a question for him of finding those things in a context that makes sense to who he is. And that's, of course, when he encounters Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and suddenly he makes sense to himself in the world. Yeah.
Are you going to make me pronounce it? We had a conversation before where she said, my challenge as a Brit is to pronounce, is it Khudai Khidmatgar?
We'll give you points, Khudai Khidmatgar. Yeah.
He joins, I've only ever had to write it down before I can spell it. I mean, it's a start. Yeah. A start again. But yeah, I mean, he joins and he finds a kind of very different way of expressing his kind of those feelings precisely, and of kind of channeling this. And it's interesting to me, I mean, he does, he joins this non-violent movement and then finds frustrations in it. Yeah. It's, again, a complicated picture of the relation to it.
It's always a complicated picture, and setting up an unarmed army is a complicated idea. Any movement you join is going to be complicated. Anything you join, once you leave the world of ideas and ideals, and you have to, then enter a world, particularly where it's in the world of realpolitik, you're going to come into all kinds of trouble, which he does, which we're not going to give away.
No, I know, I've got to stop a bit shorter there because it's really comes to this extraordinary action in that part of the book, and I really don't want to spoil it for people, but I really do recommend you buy it, although I think you might have sold out quite a lot of copies here.
I think there are copies. Go
okay, good. I hope there are copies. Definitely go and buy them afterwards. I want to see if anyone in the audience has any questions, actually, if possible now. I can't see anything, so if you could bring the house lights up a bit.
Could we have the house lights up?
So that we can see who's got their hands up. I can see one in the front. Why don't we start with this lady here in the middle of the front? And I'm sorry, I will try and see people further back when we get the lights up a bit.
Thank you. My question is that how do you select your themes for your novels?
How do I select my themes? I don't select themes. It's always interested me. I start a novel,
Thank you.
And while writing it, I discover what I'm obviously interested in because it sort of comes out. So, this book ended up being, in many ways, about competing loyalties. I had no idea what that was, although someone pointed out to me this morning that the last novel, Burnt Shadows, was also about competing loyalties, so it's clearly an issue of some kind. I have no idea why. I tend to, for me, the novel, one of the ways in which novelists create stories is we create a story about how we came to write a particular novel in a way that makes sense. But actually there are lots of different impulses that go in which sort of come together. But one of the things that I think was pretty crucial was in 2009 when Burnt Shadows, my last novel, had just been published, and I was in Karachi. And then, as now, you had bombs going off every day in Peshawar. And I would wake up in the morning and read the newspapers, and there was a bomb going off. And I had just published a novel which started in Nagasaki in 1945. And I remember thinking, I have a much clearer picture of Nagasaki in 1945 than I do of Peshawar in any time period. I don't know if this is as true in Lahore as it is in Karachi. I suspect it is. It's very easy to live your life there and know very little about Peshawar. I mean, Lahore and Karachi tend to have some, awareness of each other. But Peshawar gets talked about almost as though it's a different country. And I realize I don't have images of it. I don't have a sense of place. And if I can have a sense of place of Nagasaki, then I need, I felt I should just find out more about this place. So I just started reading. I didn't necessarily know it was going to lead to a novel. And I very quickly got incredibly drawn in by the ancient history of it. It is this fact which we should all know, It's recently named by UNESCO the world's oldest living city, which means no other city in the world has been continuously inhabited for longer. And we still don't know how long it's been, because there's an excavation site, Gor Khatri, which is at the edge of the old city. And if you go there, I don't know how many people have, there's a very, very deep pit. And they're just these stratas of history. I mean, you see objects, sort of, as they keep digging further down, they find yet more evidence of inhabitation and more evidence. And it just goes back, 1,000, 2,000, I don't know how many millennia. And when I was there, they'd run out of funds, so they'd stop digging. So they said, we have no idea how much further it goes back, how long this city has been inhabited.
Wow.
And extraordinary that we don't have the funds for that to, find out how deep is our own history. You'd think you would put some funds into that. Maybe Imran Khan's government could be told to sort that out or something.
My politics.
But it started with that, with this ancient history, and then reading about this man called Skylax. So that was one of the stories. And then the other thing was, some years earlier I had read a book called The Pathan Unarmed by Mukhlika Banerjee, which was about Khuday Khidmatgar and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. And I thought, actually, that was another story that seemed interesting to me, because we always, even in this country, if we talk about the Pashtuns, it's, oh, well, this military warlike people, and they, any chance to get into a fight. And here you had this incredible political movement which was about the opposite of that, and which had this very complex and well thought out philosophy that came out of both Islam and the Pashtun Code, which Ghaffar Khan had put together. And I thought, that's a really interesting story as well. So then I had to figure out how to marry archaeology to the Khuday Khidmatgar, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? That actually, has that been adopted from the kind of racist British view of the martial races, the idea that there were, or was that a pre-existing stereotype, do you think, of the Pathans as this warlike people?
It's really interesting. If you read the really ancient texts on, the Chinese travelers who were, in sort of, 300 BC or whenever, traveling around, and they speak with the people of the Gandhara region as sort of, this very gentle disposition. But you have Herodotus writing about them as being a very fierce warlike people. So I mean, they were clearly, you have in Herodotus the people, the Paktiaik, who were, maybe not the Pathan, because we don't know when the tribes came, but the people of the area were described by, the Paktiaik were described as fierce warlike people. But then you have, of course, Gandhara, which was great Buddhist civilization.
I think a lot of us might get pretty warlike if a load of Greeks turned up wanting our land.
Well, every empire went through this. So also this idea that no one has ever defeated, every empire came through and defeated them. The British were the first who weren't defeated, and who were defeated. And therefore, I think created the idea that they are the fierce warlike people who no one can defeat, to say, that's why they beat us, because they're that good at war.
Oh, the myths we create. Shore it up. More questions, please?
You came to the point that I was just about to make, and I just want to commend you for sort of breaking from the narrative of talking about Peshawar and the Pashtuns from the reference point of terrorism.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And how much pressure do you feel as a young Pakistani writer to continue with that narrative of talking about Pakistan from this reference point of just unending terrorism and violence?
I don't feel any pressure. Look, there is this very peculiar notion out in the world, which I wish we would disabuse ourselves of, that if you are a Pakistani writer, then there are people sitting on your shoulders saying you must write about terrorism and nine. It's nonsense. It's total nonsense. If you look at the books that have done well in the last few years, is Danial Mohiuddin's book about terrorism was a case of exploding mangoes about the Taliban. Why we get so hung up on this idea that Pakistani writers are somehow being forced to write these things. All publishing houses want books that they can sell. They want something to be able to sell. A good book, I think, can sell. And as a writer, this is the other thing. If you're writing a novel, if I'm writing a novel, that is the thing I'm going to be obsessed with. And I mean the word obsessed properly. When you finish a novel, actually my brain doesn't know what to do, because for about 3 years there have been particular subjects that every day of my life, probably every hour, I'm in some way or the other thinking about and drawing connections between. And when you're working at that intimate level with a novel and that degree of obsession, this question of what the outside world wants of you really does fall away, and it becomes you're trying to make the story work. You're really caught up in trying to make the story work. And the other thing, of course, is the novel changes shape. So this novel was going to start in 1930 and end in 2009, and it was going to end up with Peshawar blowing up. And then I thought, no, actually, that's not what this novel wants to be. It wants to start in 1915 and end in 1930. And in the end, you do what the novel wants. Otherwise, you run into huge trouble, because then you start writing a book that isn't working. And then you have to stop doing that, So,
I'm Myra, and I'm a lecturer in English at Edwards College. I belong to Peshawar. And I really enjoyed these few readings that you just read from your book, and I just can't wait to go back home and start reading your novel. My question is regarding the research that you did. What kind of research you did on Peshawar before starting off with your novel?
Yeah, the research wasn't just before. I was researching all the way through. It's one of the great ironies that the best place to be in order to write a book about Peshawar 1950, 1930 is not Peshawar necessarily, but London, because the colonial archives, the Brits were extraordinary record keepers. And even when I went to Peshawar, I went for a very short time, and I went almost with blinders on, because I didn't want to see too much of contemporary Peshawar that would disrupt my images of 1950, 1930. So I went to the museum. I'm going to say this every chance I get to speak in Pakistan. The Peshawar Museum is one of the greatest things in this country, and anyone who hasn't been there, go there. The Gandhara on display will just make your hair stand on end. It's just unbelievably beautiful, what we have here. So I went to the museum, and I went to bits of the old city and looked around, but largely wasn't watching. But the British Library has literally thousands of photographs of colonial era Peshawar. They have copies of the Archaeological Survey of India Frontier Circle every year, so you could find out all the details of what was happening in the archaeological world. And the latter half of this book is taken up by the massacre at Qissa Khwani in 1930. And there was a lot of research going into those records, and some research which turned up sort of primary research, which turned up quite astonishing things which weren't in any of the history texts I was reading. Again, they may well be in Hindko or Pashto texts, but in the English language text, the version of events that was there didn't include some really crucial stuff, which I only found because I went to the original source and read thousands and thousands. There are these files, this massive of all correspondence about this massacre. You have the Congress Inquiry Report, you have the British report, and then you have the British report on the Congress Inquiry Report and all the private letters written. So there was sort of, great depths of detail. And then for the archaeology, there was, the library, the British Library is extraordinary for that, and the British Museum, and I did go with a friend to Greece, and then sailed across to Turkey to, where I got to see the precise blue that Viv Rose Spencer speaks of there.
That's the nice bit of research,
yeah,
rather than reading the 1,000-page dusty files of police reports. But you can actually really tell in the book, before I go to the next question, as a historian, she says smoothly, it is amazing the research you've done, and you obviously did a lot of research into the classical part as well. Was it kind of, how many more books will come out of this? I actually slightly want to ask, although I'm not going to really avoid spoilers here, but there's still some stuff I want to know at the end. I'm hoping you might write a sequel.
Well, so this is the thing, is the book was, as I said, originally supposed to be 1930 to 2009. I wrote the 1930 section, and I thought, I need a little bit else. So then I actually wrote a short 1915 section. And these were sort of 30-page sections. So I wrote 1915, 1930, 1948, I think it was 67. I was halfway through 1981, and I thought this book is not working. And so I went and deleted about a year's worth of work. And thought the entire novel is 1915 and 1930. But there were, in my head, I've written, in fact, not just in my head, I've written their later lives, bits of them. So I don't know, maybe one day, one day a story will come out of there, another novel.
These are characters you'll seriously fall in love with. Honestly, you'll all want this. Any more questions?
Ms. Shamsie, I have a question.
Yes.
Since you mentioned that you were in Karachi and you did not have a sense of place of what Peshawar is really like and all of that, not just prejudices on terrorism, but, prejudice in us as people is very deeply rooted. It's either the prejudice of one kind or another, and it's not necessarily related to politics. I mean, I have been in various cities of Pakistan for 2.5 years, and sometimes I find myself telling people that Karachi is not like that, or that Lahore is not like that, and then for lack of a better answer, I never even put the assumption that it's not like that, because people want to listen to what it is like in related to politics. It just does not do to say that people are nice, that there are people that are not prejudiced. Do you think that you also write novels in for answering any set of prejudices? Do you see it that way?
I'm always very happy if someone comes up to me and says, I read your book and it changed the way I thought about whoever or whatever. It's not why I write, because I don't think a novelist should write with the idea that you are in a position to educate the world. I write to try and educate myself. There's this line that writers are often told, write what you know. I think this is a piece of advice that should be put against the wall and shot. Right? Yeah. I don't think any novelist should write about what they know. Why bother? You write as a process of discovery. There's a wonderful Irish writer called Colin McCann, and he said, I think maybe what you should say is write toward what you want to know. And that, to me, makes sense. It's not that I wanted to educate the world about Peshawar. I just thought, I need to know. I want to find out. And writing a novel becomes the best way I know of really delving into a subject and getting involved with it. So I do it for myself. And I did learn things. I mean, I don't think I was filled with prejudices against Peshawar or the Pashtun, but I still, there was so much new that I discovered in there that has informed the way I think about things. Yeah.
I think the wonderful thing for the rest of us is we just get to piggyback on your amazing knowledge and just pick it all out of there now.
I'll ask a question, and to both of you, actually, for that matter. One thing which is really fascinating is that, of course, that a lot of research went into your book, Kamila, and of course, you read lots of books and documents and all that, and of course, with Alex being there, who's a published writer too of history. I was wondering, how do you think, and it's a question to both of you, that your writing should inform academic writing on history? Because, of course, when you read the novel, you learn a lot about history, but when you read traditional history, people get bored. So how can we actually, and of course, there were, Alex's book, of course, I hope you have all read that Indian Summer is very readable.
Also available in the bookshops.
Yes, and is available at the bookshops. And actually, I can mention this, that, I used Alex's book in a class, and people said, oh, it's much easier to read this than traditional history books. So what do both of you think can be done to the art of writing that we can integrate, a novel and a history book and actually improve learning? What can actually be done so that people don't get bored by reading even a novel, for that matter?
Well, I mean, Alex writes histories. I'm a novelist, so I put fiction in there. And what Alex does is write history in a way that is, Indian Summer is, among everything else, very funny. But it's very funny in giving you actual history. And it's, I suppose I don't know whether it came out with a new journalism school, which was to make journalism use things that people had been using in fiction and bring in story and character, but not imaginary one. So I think, there are now, of course, different kinds of, I don't know why I'm answering this rather than Alex, but I'm just going to answer it as a reader, that there are different kinds of writing about history. There is an academic writing which is much drier in tone, although I don't have a problem with, I think it has its place. That, for my novel, I went and read history books, which were useful, and sometimes you want just to extract information. I don't care all that much how it's given to me. But then you have writers like Alex who will give you the history, and they've done all the research. It's a serious book of history, but it's written in a manner that is also entertaining and appealing. And of course, I would like to claim that's elements that history took from fiction, but maybe Alex would not agree with that. I mean, I don't mean from fiction in terms of making things up. I just mean that a certain style of writing.
We try not to make things up on my side of the fence. It is frowned upon to do that. Yes. But actually, although, let's not underrate also what you do, because as you said, you did a lot of primary research for this book. And I certainly learnt stuff from this. I hadn't known. There's a bit with Sir Olaf Caro, who was governor of NWFP, as it then was. Yeah. I really hadn't known that about his role.
That was, I don't think anyone had known. There's something with Olaf Caro being involved with something that happens around the massacre. And I read many history books, and I didn't find this.
No, I had never seen that.
And I spoke to Muklika Banerjee, who's written a lot about the era, and I said, this particular thing, do you know about? And she said, I haven't actually encountered. She said, when you say it, it sounds right with what was going on at the times, but I didn't know it.
No, I didn't either. So you see, you can learn something.
It was literally, in these thousands and thousands of pages, because I was looking for it. I suppose this is the other thing. It's not going to give away to say this too much. And when I was researching, first of all, this massacre, there are eyewitness reports in the Congress Inquiry Committee report. There's the actual report itself, and then at the end there are hundreds of pages of eyewitnesses' reports. And I was reading those, and a few of the eyewitnesses mentioned that after the massacre, the English took away the bodies because they want to hide the evidence of their crimes. And I thought, that's really interesting, because for a novelist, the disappeared body is a really good plot point. So I thought, I really want this to have happened so I can use this in fiction. But when I looked at the Congress, the actual final Congress report, it didn't mention it. And I thought it obviously was just one of those rumors, because the Congress was sticking it to the British as far as they could in that report, but they didn't mention this detail. So I thought they must have discounted it. They must have found out it's not right. And so I put it aside. But I really wished it had happened for the sake of the novel. And then in a later draft, I was stuck on plot. I couldn't get beyond a certain point. I thought, let me go back to research. And I went back and did more research and found out, and this was where Olaf Caro came in, that actually bodies were disposed of, and there was a very particular reason why Congress didn't put it in its report. And that was, it was this, it's this extraordinary moment when I'm sitting in the British Library in this rather, if anyone knows the what's it called, Asia and...
It is called now the Asia and Africa Studies.
The Asian Africa Studies. It's a rather dark room, and it's filled with very earnest-looking, mainly older Desi academics, looking at really ancient, like these ancient tomes which are falling apart, and tiny, minute handwriting, and they're doing really serious stuff.
These are my people.
Her people. and in the middle of this, I was reading and just found this. One of the government officials quoting a letter from Caro talking about what he did that day, and I just stopped, and I almost stopped breathing. Yeah. I couldn't believe what I was reading, and I sort of had to read it 3 times, and looked up, and everyone was carrying around doing their dingy things, and I wanted to say, this happened. Nice. Look what happened. And it's you feel really pleased that you've discovered this awful thing that really happened. But I felt completely delighted, because I needed it to happen in order for the plot to move along. And suddenly the entire plot made sense, because I could just follow the history.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does, this exactly shows that actually there is a process of exchange between these sides. It's not that strict in that respect, although we don't make things up. But, you didn't have to, which was great. But, Caro particularly, because I'd always seen him as a fairly benign figure. This is a guy who wrote the book on the Pathans, and he was, supposed to be very into it, and then absolutely horrific. Anyway, so, even more reasons to buy it.
I think we have time for one very quick question. There's a gentleman there who's anxiously holding up his hand. Yeah.
Hi, sorry, something that you said just struck me, which is you mentioned earlier that you invented the fig circlet for Skylax, but you needed this thing to happen as part of the process for the plot to move forward. Yeah. So what's the line between creating something in history and then sticking to the actual version of events, and how do you make that choice?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I had to work on. I wasn't going to accuse actual people of a crime they didn't commit. I wasn't going to say the British administration of 1930 disposed these bodies. I mean, there was enough else that they'd done that day, but I wasn't going to ascribe a crime to someone. I felt that was sort of morally problematic. But to invent an artifact, he must have had, and also the artifact, it is based on the fact that the Persian, I was reading something on sort of headwear by the Persians, and there was a particular kind of circlet which was given to heroes and men who slay monsters. And I thought, of course Skylax would have been given one of these, and he's described by Herodotus as the most trusted of Darius. So actually there was even some historical basis there that I thought it only makes sense that if such a thing existed, Skylax would have got it. But then I did invent a whole sort of, historical backstory to the actual fig circlet. And I think it's much easier, I felt much easier about inventing stuff in 515 BC. I mean, really, where you know so little.
Invented
and Herodotus invented all of that
when
stuff.
When he didn't know what was going on, just made some up.
And actually, most of his India stuff is stolen from Skylax.
Indeed so.
Yeah.
Giant
Who was
ants?
making stuff up. Yeah, giant
Is it the giant ants?
Yeah.
Yes.
So it was that, and also because I thought it was really important to talk about that massacre, which, I didn't learn in school in Karachi. I learned about Jallianwala Bagh, but I didn't learn about Qissa Khwani. And I thought also because that particular bit of the history hadn't been told, to my knowledge, it seemed more important than to get it right. Yeah.
I think that's probably going to bring us to the end of our time.
I think it will.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
If I could just say, before you run to lunch, I'm just going to say that Kamila will be signing books in Hall 2, and I so recommend this book. I'll be doing so too, but please buy hers first, because it really is amazing.
Buy hers
as well. And we'll see you there. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you. Fantastic.